Good hi, I'm Jay, and I'm of the belief that you can just make up words. After all, it's just taking concepts that you know already and putting them together to create a new one, which is perfectly acceptable. Sometimes I make up a word on the spot, and through the roots it's built out of and the context I'm using it, you can figure out pretty handily what I'm actually talking about. Like when one of my friends proposed a creative project to a group we were in, and I described the task as what the fuckian in nature. It doesn't mean insurmountable, it doesn't mean really, really big. It doesn't mean stupid to attempt, but it's kind of close to each of those. It means what the fuckian. But this time, I'm gonna make up a word and it's not clear that you'll know what it means immediately. The word is fanciversion. If you heard fancy version, you're on the right track, according to Google, but also not. How about if I say a variant of the word? Fancivert. If you're now thinking about introverts and extroverts, you're getting warmer. For those of you who don't know, introverts and extroverts are concepts used by systems like the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator to describe the difference between outgoing and shy people. Well, okay, not exactly. According to systems which categorize people this way, there's an ideally good, natural level of stimulation that our brains want to get to. Call it a recharge space for your brain. Introverts are naturally more stimulated than that ideal, and therefore they recharge and feel most comfortable when they're in low-stimulus situations, like reading or relaxing on their own. They can go out and socialize with people, they can even love doing that and have it be an integral part of their life. The only difference is they function best in their space, which is a less stimulated one. Some introverts can take a lot of high stimulus before needing to go back and recharge. Some can only take a little before they have to settle down, and all that's perfectly fine. Extroverts, on the other hand, naturally aren't as stimulated as they need to be. They lie below the line. So they'll feel better in situations where they're more stimulated, like hanging out with friends, playing games, going out on the town. They can sit inside and read a book or go on a walk alone and love doing all that, but it's outside of their zone, their space. The words themselves come from the Latin word verte, which means to orient. Introverts are more inwardly oriented, and extroverts are more outwardly oriented. I take English and writing classes one-on-one with my teacher, who's awesome, but she and I have always had very different reading preferences and comfort zones. I love sci-fi and fantasy, if you couldn't tell. I like my stories to take place as the world's ending, and maybe not even our world, but one with entirely different societies and rules. I like magic, mysticism, swords, and spells, but she goes on about realistic fiction and true stories. In our first few years together, we read How It Went Down, Slouching Towards Bethlehem, S-Town, and Catcher in the Rye. And I would always tie the concepts back to fiction and fantasy, always writing fantasy stories for creative writing, and even using stories about the real world to teach me not about the real world, but about stories. It's a mock argument we have a lot. She thinks that the most real thing is the real world and the things in it, and all the fantasy stuff just distracts from that. I think that the world is built out of ideas, and we can look more closely at those ideas if we don't have the conventions of real life distracting from it. Something that I've explored in a few video essays in the past. Our wildly different worldviews have become a running joke in our class, and we've even brought other teachers in on it. My history teacher, for instance, thinks more the way I do, and is a huge fantasy fan, from Ursula Le Guin to Alan Moore. But recently, I was going through the points with my teacher once more. We were discussing what I'd learned from reading true stories in the past year, and I thought very suddenly of that introversion-extroversion dichotomy. Introverts can venture out to the world of extroverts freely, but must always return to their own. Extroverts can explore the world of introverts easily, but must go back out to recharge. And thus I present the new dichotomy, fanciversion and resiversion. Fancy as in made up in the head, resi as in matter, real stuff. I love reading real-life stuff, and I learn from it, but my worldview is simply better suited to understand the fantastic. My teacher can read my work and appreciate it, but will always be oriented towards more concrete things. I point out this contrast not because I'm a special snowflake who's real unique and also made up a word, as so many are accused of. I'm pointing it out because I think, just as introverts and extroverts should be treated a little differently, a lot of people might be taught more effectively if this dichotomy is realized, and we find ways to speak their language. You can't exactly market Brandon Sanderson's Way of Kings or Andrew Hussey's Homestuck as introductions to philosophy in the same way you can for a book like Sophie's World, but during my philosophy class I was able to relate every concept back to a story I'd read, using what I'd learned by reading to better understand. I'm advocating that certain concepts are best explained to me by taking them to their extreme or their exaggeration, by using what might be a simple metaphor and fleshing it out, exploring what that might look like, to reveal truths about both sides. The MBTI categorizes people along 4 distinctions, sorting them into 16 personality types. I mentioned judging perceiving in my concept albums video, and this fanciversion might have to do with another one of those contrasts. Intuition versus sensing. They theorize that, just as with introverts and extroverts, there are 2 kinds of people. Those who are more practical, factual, and present, and those whose heads are a bit further up in the clouds. Intuitors are said to be more in the future, idealistic, abstract, theoretical. Fanciversion, then, might be how the intuitive sensing distinction presents itself when it comes to literature, and the fact that 3/4 of people are sensing might just be how realistic fiction got to reign supreme in the educational world. After all, if intuition is the ability, or perhaps tendency, to abstract and organize concepts in a multitude of different ways, is that not essential to recognizing the deeper themes of fantasy? Fantasy is but the rearrangement of concepts to create a new world. Perhaps one where, instead of your feelings changing the world around you by making it appear darker and by putting others in a bad mood, your feelings control the weather. Or instead of gaining credibility, self-satisfaction, and a good reputation by upholding your agreements, you gain the ability to fly and summon a cool, shiny spirit sword. The result is far different in the literal, but in the abstract, the characters each only succeed because of their honor. It's just that one is succeeding at defending a world from an evil god, and one is, like, running a cool startup or something. This intuition is what is necessary to enjoy fantasy, and it exists in different values for different people. In simple terms, some may have a stronger suspension of disbelief than others. Well, maybe that's the wrong fantasy to contextualize it in. J.R.R. Tolkien, dubbed an intuitor by the site 16 Personalities, says that the author of any fantasy creates a secondary world, which our minds treat as real in some sense. The author establishes the rules of said world, and so we don't impose the rules of this one unless we are told to. He calls it a secondary belief. The ability to occupy these different realms could be described as a distance from the real world. A distance which may in turn make it seem drab, boring, as fickle and irreal as any other fantasy. One who is more grounded would see it as having your head in the clouds, while one who relies more on the ethereal could accuse the sensory types of having narrow minds or a nose stuck in the dirt. I am by no means suggesting that personality tests such as the Myers-Briggs type indicator are infallible, the be-all and end-all of it. To suggest that your personality type is fixed and that the categories exist with no nuance in between seems ridiculous to me. Like the New Yorker says, we have the tendency to put people into categories, and while not perfect fits, there are such things as ambiverts after all, the MBTI is as good a system as any for doing just that. Well, judges put things into categories, but since this test said I'm on the perceiving end of the scale, I don't really have... Think of it as just another way to rearrange concepts, another magic system, if you will. As any in this vein will attest, all magic systems have relevance to the real world, and Fanciversion is no different. Fantasy is just as valuable to some people's understanding or enjoyment as realistic fiction is to others, and we can't afford to stigmatize either. Fantasy is not just for kids, realism is not just for adults. Tolkien outlines this quality in his essays, saying, "I think this is an error, at best an error of false sentiment, and one that is therefore most often made by those who, for whatever private reason, tend to think of children as a special kind of creature, almost a different race rather than normal, if immature members of a particular family, and of the human family at large. And the sooner we realize that, the better off I think we'll be." I also must encourage everyone to expand their vocabulary. If someone's made up a term or phrase, don't attack them for it, just try to understand. Yes, if there are too many words and they're too prescriptive or specific, it becomes a mess and difficult to understand, and we wouldn't want language to be difficult to understand. If there's a concept that there just isn't a word for and you think it's vitally important to be able to reference and explore, or maybe if you just like how it sounds, then make it up. I'm urging you to look at language in perhaps a more abstract, fantastical fashion. It isn't static. It's a strange way of exchanging concepts with each other, beautiful not for its perfection, but for its ability to convey feeling and thought. So if it's not doing its job, change it. As long as someone's expressing something and someone else understands, it's part of the language, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. But I do hope you'll tell me what you thought of this exploration. Was my concept a sound one, and did I explain it well enough? If not, I can guarantee I've got a video planned that will explain it even worse. Perhaps I will see you then.